My name is Brian Klass. I'm from the University of Oxford, shortly transitioning over to the London School of Economics. And I'm going to talk to you about Cote d'Ivoire. I know that there's probably a vast array of knowledge in the country of Cote d'Ivoire and of varying levels. So in 1 hour, I'm going to try to give the best overview I can that speaks to people who have relatively little knowledge of the country and also to people who are quite involved in following what's happening in Abidjan these days. So the basic overview I want to give to set the stage is that there's an election coming up in October. It's scheduled for the end of October. And Cote d'Ivoire has a French-style system with elections, 2 tiers. So if one candidate does not clear the 50% threshold in the first round, there'll be a runoff election in the second round. That happened in 2010 with the last election. And it went to a second-round contest, and Laurent Gbagbo was defeated in the contest officially. The Constitutional Court invalidated the results. They were in Gbagbo's camp, and Alassane Ouattara was declared the legitimate victor by the international community, which then intervened militarily on his behalf. There was a short, low-level civil war, and Laurent Gbagbo was arrested and ultimately is now being tried at the International Criminal Court in The Hague. So there's a precedent for violent elections in Cote d'Ivoire, which I will get into a bit of the history as well during this presentation. But the overall gist of the talk, I want to make 3 main points. One is that Cote d'Ivoire is one of the fastest growing countries in the world, and it's been in sustained growth mode, approaching 10% since the end of the civil war in 2011. I believe that's likely to continue, particularly if the election goes well. The second point is I do think the election will go well. I think that the most likely scenario is that Alassane Ouattara will win the election and that there will be low-level violence, not sufficient levels of violence to destabilize the country or to jeopardize future growth. The third point is, however, as Stefano said, there are risks, and I think it's important to be aware of these, even though I think they're less likely this time around. There are reasons to believe that there could be some outbreaks of sustained violence that could jeopardize the economic growth for at least 2016. And I'll get into all these points in further detail, but just to sort of set the stage for what I'm going to be talking about today. So, the basics of Cote d'Ivoire. Let's look at what the country looks like in terms of some basic factors that might be relevant to investors. So, the population is 24 million people. It's a relatively large country on the African continent. It's not the DRC or Ethiopia, but it's one of these large West African hubs. It's akin to the size of Australia in population, or Ghana, Mozambique, Cameroon, this type of size of country. The GDP and purchasing power parity is about 72 billion, as last year's figures. So this is akin to the economy the size of Bolivia, Costa Rica, Lithuania, Panama, Jordan. A mid-sized economy. It's an emerging market. Now, the emerging market is largely based on cocoa production, and this is something that the Ouattara government, since the election in 2010, has been focusing on trying to diversify the economy to some success. However, cocoa is really the lifeblood of Cote d'Ivoire's economy, and anytime that you eat a chocolate bar from Cadbury's or Nestle or Hershey's, whatever, odds are that it has cocoa from Cote d'Ivoire in it. They're responsible for about 40% of the world's production, which is by far the largest producer of cocoa. The second place country is neighboring Ghana, which is responsible for about 20% of the world's cocoa production. So 60% of any chocolate that you consume is likely to have come from these 2 countries neighboring in West Africa. So this is something that I'll get to in how cocoa's played a role in conflict and peace both, and how the economy will hopefully continue to rely on it while diversifying and branching out into other investments. Now, some of those other investments include coffee and palm oil. About 2/3 of the country's workers are employed in some way or another in the agricultural sector, so this is still the behemoth in Cote d'Ivoire's economic growth. But as I said, there are other opportunities. So, for example, oil. There were 2 offshore oil discoveries in 2012 and the potential for more to come. So the government has done some major assessments of oil production capacity and possibilities. Currently, about 60,000 barrels of oil equivalent a day are being produced in Cote d'Ivoire. But by 2020, the government believes it's realistic to have around 200,000. So to put that in context around the world, this is currently akin to Turkey or Germany's oil production, not major powerhouses in the oil market. But the target is more like Gabon, and this is a major African oil producer and has the potential to grow significantly in the next 5 years. Gold is another area where mineral resources are proving to be lucrative in Cote d'Ivoire. And it's basically where Ghana is lagging behind Cote d'Ivoire in cocoa production, Ghana is leading Cote d'Ivoire in gold production. But the gap is narrowing, and this is something where mineral investments have been really key at exploiting these resources and discovering new deposits. So in 2014, you can see the current production is around 17 tons. There's a growth, though, of 8 tons predicted in just 1 year. So this is something that's very rapidly changing and is a very promising market for new economic growth in Côte d'Ivoire. So clearly there's a lot of potential, and this has been shown by the fact that the growth rate last year was 8.5% in Côte d'Ivoire. It was around 10% in 2012. Now, we have to put these numbers in context, right? Because in 2010-11, there was a major political crisis, and the economy stagnated and declined. So it would have been difficult to not have growth when there was the resumption of peace. But that being said, Alassane Ouattara, who I'll talk about more in depth, he's an economist who worked at the IMF for many years and is trained in economics and is very aware of how to manage an economy. And I think most people who are objective observers will say that he's doing a very good job. That's why next year the growth rate that's predicted is approaching 10%. It's 9.5, 9.6%, depending on which indexes you look at. But heading into the October vote, this looks like a very, very promising situation and a very promising place for 2016. But there are also major risks, as I said. And the main risk is security. So, excuse me. There have been many contentious elections in Côte d'Ivoire since the introduction of multi-party politics. I'll talk a little bit about the history because I think the history in Côte d'Ivoire is quite important to understanding the future. But the possibility is there for violence to break out. And elections, I believe strongly in democracy. I think that elections are a fantastic thing. But they also regularize volatility, as I'm sure you're all aware. And this is something where a lot of investors are probably waiting to see how things play out in October and November of this year. And we will see. I mean, as I said, I think the outlook is positive, but there's a few sort of warning signs as well. So we need to look at some of the most recent violent history. I touched briefly on the 2010-2011 election dispute, but there's a deeper history here. And so this is something where in the 1990s, multi-party elections began. They went relatively smoothly for most of the 90s. In 1999, there was a coup. In 2000, there was another election. 2002 to 2007, a civil war. And then again, another election in 2010 and another low-level civil war. So this is out of character in Côte d'Ivoire's history, as I'll talk about in more detail. But this is something where it's not unprecedented to have an election produce violence. And these divides, while being healed, are still present. So I'm going to now talk about, this is the very quick overview, which historians would absolutely hate, of basically 50 years and 4 slides. But Côte d'Ivoire became independent from France in 1960, and the man pictured there, President Houphouët-Boigny, is sort of the archetypal example. For my students, I say, this is the guy who managed patronage systems and one-party states effectively, and he did. He's not regarded as being a despot. He was a single-party ruler, but he managed to grow the economy and include everyone in the economy, and so that the spoils were shared. And the way he did this, and this is I promise it's relevant for current forecasting, is that he invited. There was not sufficient labor to field the very, very fertile land in western Côte d'Ivoire that would produce cocoa, and it would produce the cocoa boom that Côte d'Ivoire rode for decades. So he said, look, I'm going to open up the borders, and anyone who comes in that farms the land owns the land. And this meant that there was a hub in West Africa for economic opportunity where there was not in some of these other countries. Burkina Faso and Mali at the time were major sources of labor. So a mass migration came in, and about 25% of the population ended up being foreign-born. And they started to integrate into Côte d'Ivoire. They farmed the land, they owned the land, and cocoa production rose considerably. And this is something that happened throughout the 1960s. And unlike many African rulers at the time, he reinvested the profits from cocoa into social spending and did so with education and healthcare programs that were largely unrivaled on the continent, which meant that the country was set up for multi-decade growth rather than just a boom. Now, in the 70s, that paved the way for the Ivorian miracle. What's the term that's thrown around with Côte d'Ivoire is that Abidjan was the Paris of Africa. The Ivorian miracle was this post-independent success story. It was the poster child of what every other African ruler was supposed to aspire to emulate. And so this is something where the boom was really happening. The political situation was extremely stable. The pie was growing, and everyone was getting a slice. And as a result, Félix Houphouët-Boigny, the president, maintained power for 33 years. Now, there were bumps in the road, however, and those started to seep in the 1980s. So the 1980s was a time where 1978, as you can imagine, a cocoa boom economy is subject to volatility. If price fluctuations happen, a lot of eggs are in one basket for the entire country. And that fluctuation, a minor fluctuation, happened in 1978, but it forced Cote d'Ivoire to turn to the IMF for credit. And what happened here was that basically structural adjustment programs, which were all the rage in the 70s and 80s throughout the emerging markets in Latin America and sub-Saharan Africa, the IMF looked at Cote d'Ivoire, and I apologize if any of you are IMF affiliated or major IMF fans, but I think they really, really botched this one. They basically said, your comparative advantage is cocoa production, and you're going to put even more of your eggs in that same basket because that's what you're really good at. And you've got the labor for it, you have the land for it, you have everything is primed for cocoa production. So they said, look, you can take our money, but if you do that, you have to slash social spending, education and healthcare. Those are wasteful because they're not deemed to be furthering cocoa production. And you have to put more money into this single commodity, right? So Félix Houphouët-Boigny did exactly that. He took the money. They incurred a massive amount of debt. It was around 230% of their GDP going into the 90s. So a heavily indebted country as a result. And what happened was, lo and behold, they put more money into cocoa production. More cocoa was made, but the appetite for cocoa around the world did not keep up. And inevitably, this cocoa boom ended up producing a self-fulfilling cocoa bust at a time when basically even more of the economy was reliant on it, and there was less of a social safety net to protect people from the dislocation that occurred as a result of this downfall. So the cocoa price basically went to a third of its pre-1980s price throughout the 1980s. You can imagine a drop of that significance when you're that reliant on a single commodity had major ramifications for the economy. Now, unfortunately for Cote d'Ivoire, that coincided with the onset of multi-party democracy. So the president died in 1993, and the first major competitive elections happened in 1995. So if you can think about what I said previously about inviting everyone in to farm the land and own the land in the West, that produced some tensions when the economy started to crumble. It was fine in the 70s, it was fine in the 60s, it was even fine to some extent in the 80s because people were not that worried about losing land to foreigners at a time when there was a significant amount of economic growth happening. But as soon as the economic contraction began and the pie got smaller and people were more territorial about the pie, Western Cote d'Ivoire, which is the major hub of the cocoa fields, started to become a little bit of a tinderbox waiting to be lit on fire. And politicians realized that this resentment existed. And previously, the president had a major strong interest in keeping everyone sort of included, rotating through the cabinet so that everyone had a representative in the government. Well, elections are about competition. They're not about cooperation. So ultimately, this brought in a situation where there was a political tactic known as ivoirité, and this is something that's quite relevant for this election because it has not gone away. And it was the idea that foreigners are not Ivorian citizens. They came in the 60s, they took our land, and now they're taking our benefits. I mean, this narrative might sound familiar, but it's something where in Cote d'Ivoire, this was a political tool. It was something where southern politicians realized that they could paint, or they could use a wedge between themselves and the northerners in the country, who tended to be Muslim rather than Christian, as the southerners were predominantly. They tended to be, there's a significant proportion that had come from Burkina Faso and Mali, but there's obviously also a major proportion of northern residents of Cote d'Ivoire who've lived there for generations. So the politicians in the south realized, if we start saying that people in the north are not actually Ivorians, that means that our major electoral opponents are going to be excluded, right? They can't vote because they're not actually Ivorian. And that's a really good political strategy going into multi-party elections because you can make it so people who are your rivals don't get a say, right? So this notion of ivoirité really seeped into the political system throughout the 1990s. And Henri Konan Bédier, who I'll talk about a little bit in the context of this election, he used this to his advantage. He became president after the death of Félix Houphouët-Boigny, and he excluded from the 1995 contest Alassane Ouattara, who's now the president of Cote d'Ivoire. Now, this all speaks to why there are tensions, right? Because in 1995 and 2000 both, Alassane Ouattara, who was the major political representative for the northern half of the entire country, was not allowed to stand for office on the notion that he was not an Ivorian citizen. Now, this is a murky question. His mother was born or believed to have been born in Burkina Faso, but this is difficult to ascertain because at the time when she was born, it was French West Africa. I mean, this was part of a colony, right? So the borders were not clearly defined. And so trying to get a certificate of birth with the exact location and where they fall within the borders now was not easy. All this is background to say that the exclusion of Ouattara was codified with a constitutional change that was squarely levied at him, right? It was anyone whose mother is foreign-born, anyone who has not lived in Cote d'Ivoire for the last 5 years. Ouattara was working for the IMF in Washington at the time. All these different aspects of Ouattara's own candidacy were used as weapons against him to exclude him. So 1995 and 2000 both roll around with the exclusion of Ouattara, and as a result, the election proceeds without the northern half of the country having any say in the political situation, right? Not exactly the recipe for an inclusive political transition between, particularly at a time when the economy is still sort of in free fall. I mean, it wasn't as bad in the 90s as it was in parts of the 80s, but it was still not growing fast. So the 90s onset of multi-party democracy really paved the way for war and conflict in the 2000s. And this is something, as I alluded to, there was a coup in 1999, on Christmas Day of 1999. There was an election that happened in 2000. Again, Ouattara was excluded. Northerners did not have a candidate represented on the ballot. And in 2002, the Northerners decided they'd had enough, and Northern Cote d'Ivoire rebelled against Southern Cote d'Ivoire in 2002. It developed into a low-level conflict for 5 years, and the country split in half. It's almost a perfect line down the middle. The north was controlled by people who were sympathetic to Ouattara's movement. The south, people who were loyalists to, at the time then, President Gbagbo, who is a major protagonist in the future conflicts. This is all to say that there was a 5-year period where two countries existed fundamentally. And the reason why it was able to exist on the daily life, there wasn't 5 years of prolonged violence. It was low-level fighting for a lot of the 5 years after the initial period of major violence. And cocoa was a major reason for this because cocoa producers have been implicated in funding both sides of the conflict in order to extract the cocoa from the country, potentially in violation of sanctions. But it was something where, for Northerners and Southerners alike, getting black market payments for cocoa was higher. It was a higher cost benefit analysis for them than going back to normal life, where both the country was in peace and cocoa payments were simply not involved with elevated rates. So this prolonged until 2007, and in 2007 a peace accord was signed, and it paved the way for elections in 2010. Now, I alluded a little bit to the 2010 election, but the dynamics here are quite important for understanding the dynamics going forward into October's contest. So in 2010, 2011, the results were announced in the second round. In the first round, Gbagbo actually won the most votes. He won 37% to Ouattara's 32%. And there was a third candidate who was a member of the PDCI, which is the former president, Houphouët-Boigny, the guy who was in charge in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and early 90s, his party. And he was the third place candidate, but he swung his support to Ouattara in the second round, and Ouattara got the boost from the third candidate coming behind him. And ultimately, the election commission released results that said, Ouattara won by a narrow margin. Now, the Constitutional Court, which was stacked by President Gbagbo, said, well, actually, you guys don't have the authority to release the results, and we do. So they said, when we looked back at the election, these 7 northern provinces didn't exactly have perfect elections, so we're just going to invalidate those results and strip Ouattara of 500,000 votes. And oh my goodness, that means it's 51-49 for Gbagbo. So this was the result that was announced by the Constitutional Court, and it was obviously blatantly rigged. And it was something where the French community and international community, in support of the French, said, okay, we're actually going to intervene here. And so there was militias formed, the former rebels that were involved in managing military, the northern half of the country during the previous civil war. They got involved. The militias that were pro-Gbagbo got involved. And ultimately, there was a 4-month standoff that ended when UN and French peacekeeping forces actively backed the Ouattara camp, intervened on his behalf, and Gbagbo was arrested. And a short time, about 6 months later, he was extradited and charged with crimes against humanity. Now, this is something, this is at the heart of why there's potential volatility in 2015. There is, I think pretty much every human rights group that observes Cote d'Ivoire would agree that there were problems on both sides of this conflict. Ouattara's camp won, but Ouattara's soldiers were surely implicated in similar acts of violence against civilians as Gbagbo's camp. There's no smoking gun that shows the chain of command the same way it does with Gbagbo potentially. But I think a lot of the Gbagbo supporters would say, well, we were wronged, and this is a system that has affirmed victor's justice. So keep this in mind in the sense that there's this history of exclusion, right? So for a decade in the 1990s, the northern half had no access to political power. Then in the 2000s, there's conflict. Then going into 2010, 2011, there's again an election, but this results in ultimately the exclusion of Southerners from the government because Ouattara won and inevitably did not bring in Gbagbo supporters to his government. So these divides, while better than they were, still exist. Now, the conflict ended in 2011, and the economy responded very quickly. So there's an expectation of I think I said 9.5% before, but it's 9.4, I'm sorry, percent growth in 2015. And it's something that could be potentially even higher in 2016. Obviously, these forecasts are highly risk dependent depending on how the election comes out. But there's this quickly rebounded and is poised to continue to rebound. There's a 40% increase in foreign direct investment in Cote d'Ivoire between 2012 and 2014. So this is obviously something that's an important aspect of economic growth. The African Development Bank, which had fled, its headquarters had relocated to Tunis. The political stability of Tunis in the context of the 2010-2011 election. And they have since returned, so the headquarters is now in Abidjan. So again, it's a major West African hub for economic capital. And going back to what Houphouët-Boigny did in the 60s and 70s that paved the way for the Ivorian miracle, Alassane Ouattara's management of the economy has not just been about short-term economic growth. He's really investing in the long-term future of the country. So in just the last 3 years, there's been more than 15,000 classrooms built in the country. And, I mean, you can see the shocking and really quite impressive change, school enrollment up nearly 20% in the span of 7 years. So these are encouraging signs for longer-term dynamics beyond the election. Now, the IMF issued a report this month talking about its post-conflict optimism and its optimism heading into the elections in October. And it says, on the political front, political institutions such as the Independent Electoral Commission have been reinforced and have the confidence of all political parties in the civil society. Now, I think that this is true, but also glosses over the fact that there's a lot of people who view elections in a post-conflict environment like Cote d'Ivoire as something that can be potentially a catalyst for volatility. And I think that people who have lost elections tend not to believe that the Independent Electoral Commission was independent, whether it was or not. So this is something that is it's a thing where the international community is really confident about the electoral process. Many reforms have been made heading into October, and the Independent Commission, I think, is reasonably independent. But it is something where perceptions often matter more than reality in these contexts, and that's something that I'll touch on when I talk a little bit more about the future risks. So let's talk about the 2015 election specifically. Keep all the background history in mind because these characters often reoccur, and also the dynamics are, the historical dynamics really do play out in modern politics. So this is the president, Alassane Ouattara, and as I said, good management of the economy since he took over, perceived to be somebody that the West can do business with, and perceived to be somebody who's sort of a good governance reform type. Now, there's not uniform praise for him. Human Rights Watch, for example, issued a condemnation of him 2 days ago because he's closing inquiries into post-election violence that are, in their view, somewhat unresolved. And this again plays into this idea of whether or not there's victor's justice that's been at play. Inevitably, there's some form of victor's justice in every conflict situation because if Ouattara had lost, he might be at the ICC. So, but overall, this is somebody who I think, in the context of Cote d'Ivoire's history, probably the best and most insightful economist ever to be at the helm of a country in recent memory anyway. And it's something that I think, regardless of people's political stripes, one of the reasons why I think this election is a cause for optimism is because I think there are many people who I spoke to in Cote d'Ivoire who said, yeah, we don't like Ouattara, we don't like his forces, but the economy is growing, and that's something that we're willing to vote for. So this is the main protagonist. Now, I think the likely outcome is Ouattara is going to win. I think most observers would agree with me. And this is a quote from an excellent blog called Drogba's Country, named after Didier Drogba, who's the famous Ivoirian football player. And almost every bar in Abidjan, by the way, is called Drogba Bar. But so the likely outcome is, the quote here is, I don't think that most Ivory Coast observers regard the 2015 presidential elections as anything much more than a foregone conclusion. Now, this doesn't mean that it's going to be necessarily a walk in the park. It doesn't mean that there's going to be no conflict. It doesn't mean that there will be that the opposition will accept results. And there's also a major aspect here about whether or not Ouattara can win in the first round. If he can, I think things will go a lot more smoothly than if he can win in the second round. And I'll get to that a little more. But I think overall the outlook is, if you're going to be a gambling person and you want to place a bet, I would put it on Ouattara winning. Now, one of the main reasons for this is because Henri Konan Bédié, who was the president who I talked about in the 90s, bizarrely is now in coalition with Ouattara, who he excluded throughout the 90s. So when Bédié was in power, it looked like a really good political strategy to get rid of all the northerners. Now Ouattara has ascended, and Bédié wants on the gravy train and is a friend of Ouattara and says, look, we're in alliance, and I'm not going to stand as a candidate, and the PDCI is not going to put a candidate forward. And remember, the PDCI was the third place winner of votes in the 2010 first round election. So he is actively supporting Ouattara's candidacy and has thrown his support behind him. Now, it's unclear how much allegiance PDCI voters will have to Bédié, but on a strict reading of just the 2010 results, Bédié's 25% plus Ouattara's 32%, puts them at 57% between them. Now, obviously, dynamics have changed. Ouattara will probably get a boost from the fact that the economy's done well. But these figures do lead you to make an educated guess that there's support here that might mean that this is a first-round win. And a first-round win is so unbelievably, just firm that the likelihood of opposition breaking out seems lower. Now, the only reason why there's a but to this side, if I was giving this talk a year ago, I would have said Ouattara will win, period. This has changed slightly, and the reason for that is because the opposition, which has been fractured for a long time and has been divided between different power bases and personalities, has coalesced into a unified front. Now, how unified is a question that's up for debate, but they've formed, as of the 15th of May last month, the National Coalition for Change, known as the CNC in French, and it's a group of very disparate political actors who share basically two goals, and one of them is that Gbagbo should be released from prison in the interest of national reconciliation, and second is that Ouattara should not win. That's about all they have in common. So that's one of the reasons why, if they can coalesce behind a figure, they might be a formidable force, especially in a second-round vote. If they can't, and they remain divided, then it's going to be a really easy election for Ouattara to win, I think. So who's in the CNC? So Charles Konan Bédié, who's a former prime minister. He was affiliated with the PDCI, which is Bédié, the guy who's backing Ouattara, his party. Bédié is somebody who's very ambitious politically, and the election law that says who can and cannot be a candidate would exclude Bédié beyond 2015 because he will be too old. So basically, this is the last shot. But he's said, I'm running, right? But he also signed on to the CNC, which is a coalition, and they're only going to have one candidate, they say. So this is a bit of a tricky issue, right? So Bédié's going to be vying against Laurent Akun, potentially, who has not been usually a politician in his own right, but was one of the major figures in the Gbagbo camp. This is a picture I took at the FPI headquarters. FPI is the party that Gbagbo ran from. And so to our detained friends is what the poster is for. But Laurent Akun is a major player in the FPI, and it was a major shift when in May he agreed to join the CNC because the FPI still exists outside the coalition. But he also will be potentially vying or potentially trying to be a kingmaker, but he was a top advisor to Gbagbo before. And by the way, I mean, one of the things where I was talking about tensions and sort of winner-take-all politics, a lot of the people I interviewed who are former Gbagbo allies, like one of the guys who was a top advisor to Gbagbo, he now teaches in a music school in Abidjan, which he's personally very happy. But when you think about a lot of the people's interests, after losing an election, this is a high-stakes contest, and it's something where their livelihoods are really wrapped up in this election. And that's one of the reasons why every African election, I think, or almost every African election, has the potential for some sort of volatility. But another CNC member is Mamadou Koulibaly. And he's a fascinating character this is evolving in its own right as we speak. I mean, last night, or 2 nights ago, I think it was, he tweeted his discontent with the CNC, saying that they're trying to bring back ivoirité politics. So that's what I talked about, the exclusionary aspect of anti-foreigner sentiment and all this. Koulibaly is not on board with that type of angle. And so already, just 1 month into the formation of this anti-Ouattara coalition, there's already splinters starting to show, right? And this is one of the reasons why I say, this is one of the reasons why I say there's the potential for more of a contest or less of a contest depending on how the CNC splits, right? If it splits, there's going to be a divided first round vote, and if Ouattara wins the first round, that's the end, right? If they can rally behind whoever's the strongest candidate in the second round, they could potentially pose a threat. But as I said, this is Bani's last shot. What is he going to do if the CNC powers to be pick Koulibaly and say he's our candidate, right? Is he really going to rally behind him and say, yeah, I'm not going to stand? He's already got a campaign. He's already got his own independent movement. So these are major questions that are currently unresolved. But given these sort of cracks beginning to show, there are some problems that could be quite consequential for the CNC. On top of it, the other reason why I think this might not matter is because the FPI is running its own candidate, Pascal Affi-N'Guessan, and he is somebody who says, I'm running, right? And the FPI is divided in its own right. There are hardliners who say, we can't possibly contest this election because Ouattara has stacked the Independent Electoral Commission, or we can't possibly contest this election because Gbagbo is still in prison, and we're going to boycott anything until Gbagbo is released. But there's also sort of the pragmatists among the FPI who say, look, Gbagbo's ship has sailed and sailed very far away from here, and we need to have our party really contest this vote. Because otherwise we're just left out in the cold for the next 5 years, the way that Ouattara was when he was excluded. So as a result, even if the CNC rallies behind a single candidate, which may happen, may not happen, the FPI is still going to have another person on the ballot, which leads me to believe that there's a higher likelihood of a first-round victory because the opposition will be divided, and that will give Ouattara a boost, especially with Bédier's backing from the PDCI. So as I said, there's cracks showing in the opposition. This is the bottom line, and it's why I think I'm quite comfortable predicting a Ouattara victory, barring some major changes between now and October. So I wanted to do some forecasting about the most likely scenario and some of the other possible scenarios along with the risks that are involved. So the most likely scenario, Ouattara wins, as I've said, a few outbreaks of violence. I think some of the hardliners that are in the pro-Gbagbo camp might try to engage or make trouble around the election, but probably not enough to destabilize the country. Particularly because there's UN peacekeepers on the ground, about 5,000 of them, and continued growth. I think this is probably the most likely scenario, and as investors, I would be confident that this is a place that's likely to have pretty high growth for the short to medium term future. Other reasons for optimism. Convincing Ouattara victory would reduce the likelihood of post-election violence because there'd be no point. It's not like a 51-49 contest where they think you could potentially swing the outcome if it's a commanding victory. Opposition groups also, including the FPI, have been engaged in peaceful dialogue with the government. They've been, it's the type of thing where rather than holding protests individually, they've held protests after asking for protest permits from the government. And this type of engagement was unthinkable even 5 years ago, 10 years ago. It was something where there was such harsh divides that there was no dialogue. And so this is a very promising development, and it's something that's been ongoing, especially in the last couple months. And it's a hopeful sign that whatever the election result, the opposition will accept. Also, former President Gbagbo's trial has been postponed until after the vote. So originally it was supposed to start in July. It's now been postponed to November. That's good and bad. I mean, the good thing is that he's not going to be in the headlines or a major catalyst for violence, I would say, if it was during the trial and all these things were coming out about war crimes and the FBI was feeling like it was being unfairly maligned in the press. That won't happen until November. On the other hand, November is when the second round election is supposed to happen. So when some of the trial aspects come out in the media, it could be potentially a little bit more of a destabilizing force in November. But I don't really think that the mainstream pro-Gbagbo camp is really that allied to specifically Gbagbo. I think many people have moved on with the FPI, and it's not that they don't have immense respect for Gbagbo, but that they have a pragmatic view of the election, and they think we can still win this. Cause for concern, though, there are a few causes for concern. So 13,000 former militants have not completed the disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration program. It's a program aimed to getting former rebels and former militias, and also sort of anything that was involved with the informal military, demobilized and burning their guns, as you saw in the opening slide. And the program ends today, and the latest count was that 13,000 people hadn't completed it. So there's still, in a country like Cote d'Ivoire, where you can have a civil war breakout with a couple thousand people in a militia. This is something where if the political situation turned really, really bad, I would be concerned about who these people are and what they're planning to do. There are also, as I said, radical elements in the pro-Gbagbo camp, and they'll likely use the election to launch some sort of attacks. There's occasionally still sporadic violence in the West where people have territory concerns about who's farming cocoa, who really owns the land, etc. And those it's very low-level violence, but there was still an attack in January. So there's various aspects that are sort of simmering here. In particular, there's also been, as I said, the attacks in the West, but there's also informal links between non-state actors in Liberia and Cote d'Ivoire. The border is quite porous at many points, and there's potential for spillover violence from opportunistic militias coming in from Liberia. Security situation in general, though, is imperfect. So the UN Security Council issued a report this month saying that there's large amounts of unregulated arms and ammunition available in the country. Obviously, this is something that's a sort of it's a feasibility factor in terms of post-election violence. If you're thinking about potentially launching any form of violence and you have easy access to guns and bullets, that makes everything a lot easier. But, as I said, I still think this is an outside chance. There's lack of cohesion in the military. I think that's a problem, but I think it's less of a problem because the UN peacekeepers are there. And actually, 5 days ago, the UN reaffirmed the mandate of the peacekeeping force in Cote d'Ivoire for another year. So at least through June 2016, there'll be UN forces on the ground. The peacekeepers are a stabilizing force writ large, and I think the deterrent effect of them might be important in the election because they showed very clearly in 2010, 2011 that they're not afraid to intervene militarily if somebody is trying to usurp the legitimately elected leader. So they've got 5,437 military personnel and 1,500 police personnel in the country. That's a fairly sizable force in terms of the numbers for the military and also any potential rebel force or militia that would be radicalized around the election. The key question, though, if you're looking at the news, is will the opposition accept the results? And this is something to watch very, very closely if you're trying to figure out how this is going to turn. Hopefully, what will happen is the opposition will accept, whether it's win or lose. But there's multiple sort of gradations of rejection of results, right? There's the very standard rejection of results that happens all the time, where it says let's challenge through there are irregularities, which inevitably in almost every sub-Saharan African election there are some sort of irregularities. It can be as small as one polling location opening late, but there's grounds at least to appeal the election result through the courts. That's probably very likely. That does not mean that there's a major problem afoot, because that means that they're still engaged in the formal political process, right? They're saying we're going to trust the courts enough to verify this election results, and for now we're on board with whatever they decide. A complete rejection of the results without the courts is more troubling. It's something, especially if violence accompanies it. But again, this is a question of, do we think that this is a major problem if there's sporadic violence? There might be some shooting in some certain areas of Abidjan. There might be some shooting in Western Cote d'Ivoire, but it's not going to be of the caliber that necessarily derails the economic potential for the country. Now, if there's if somehow there could be escalations of this scenario, so it could be worse, but it's unlikely. So. And Ouattara is very, very keen on making sure that this does not happen. So he understands the donor community very well, having been involved with donor circles in Washington for many years, and he's assured everyone, as I think probably every president would assure, but I think he's very committed to saying this is a peaceful, democratic, open election, and I think that he's really taking on board some of the technical aspects of election monitors, where they say you must do this, this, and this, and making the reforms that are necessary to have a clear and transparent process. The more transparent and the more that the international community rallies behind the election as a genuine representation of citizen preferences will be very, very good for Ouattara's prospects of maintaining stability after the election if he wins. So, as I said, the most likely outcome, Ouattara wins, isolated violence. The X factor is Gbagbo. The reason I say that is because There are some rumors that Gbagbo has connections to people who are currently in Ivorian politics and is trying to tell them to do certain things. There's the possibility of the media outcome, as I said, with the trial. All these things are possible, but again, I would discount the risk as being it exists, but it's not. I don't think it's substantial. Unlikely but possible. This is something that can also tarnish the election, is a boycott. And it's something that last year was on the table. So the FPI had originally said, we're going to boycott the election. Now, this was a major problem for Ouattara and also for the donor community and investors because the likelihood of post-election violence may be low, but you can hardly call an election a legitimate contest if the major opposition party doesn't present a candidate. So, and donor communities are oftentimes very wary of this happening. That's something that's important in Cote d'Ivoire because obviously if the donor community puts targeted sanctions or something like that on the country or they pull the plug on aid, that has economic implications for the country's growth. Now, currently the fact that there is a pretty robust dialogue between the opposition and the incumbent government is very promising, right? This means that they're invested, and the talks of a boycott have been really, really diminished in recent days. There's hardliners in the CNC who say the Independent Election Commission is not doing its job. It's not doing voter registration properly. All these different aspects, but by and large, I think they're not sufficient concerns to provoke a boycott. If this happens, though, I would be a little bit more worried about the outcome. I think that it's very difficult to govern a country without the mandate of legitimacy, and there's the likelihood that Ouattara would try to potentially call new elections. But we'll see. I mean, time will tell. These are the things that, in the interim, looking at whether the opposition accepts or rejects the results, obviously is something to watch closely after the election. Before the election, any talk of boycott, I would watch closely. As I said, unlikely but possible is also widespread conflict. It's plausible, it's unlikely. But this is something that this would torpedo any chance of major economic growth in 2016. So the overall outlook, just to wrap up, is Cote d'Ivoire, I think, is one of the most attractive places in sub-Saharan Africa currently to invest. It's got a proven track record in the last 5 years of sustained growth in new sectors, diversifying economy. A lot of good political decisions have been made, and over time, I think if the election proves peaceful and the opposition gets on board, I think that this will be a place where until 2020 at least, it should be primed for approaching double-digit growth. Now, this is also the subtext of the election. I mean, as investors, you probably know that a lot of times in sub-Saharan Africa, particularly in volatile places like Cote d'Ivoire, there's a difficulty of seeing the long-term future, and sometimes investments are shorter, 3 or 5 year investments. Probably conforming to election cycles. But one of the subtexts of this election that's going to be really important, I think, is who's going to replace Ouattara in 2020. And that's something that, 6 months after the election, assuming it goes well, this is what I would look at for reading the tea leaves. And I think the RDR, which is Ouattara's party, is poised to do well in 2020 as well. But their presumed successor, and the one whose name has been thrown around, who's been prime minister and a major figure in the Ouattara government, is Guillaume Soro. Now, this goes back to the history of Cote d'Ivoire and why these problems do not just disappear every time there's an election, right? So Guillaume Soro's past, before he joined the government after the Civil War, he was the head of the rebel force, right? So he was previously a student leader, sort of like the president of his university, and then he joined the Force Nouvelle when the Civil War broke out in 2002. And became this major political player and kingmaker in Ivorian politics as a result of the Civil War. Now, the reason this is important is because if he's the presumed successor, then the stakes are raised in the future for people who believe that this is a system that encourages victor's justice. The reason I say that is because Ouattara did a very good job of distancing himself from the rebellion. He was the presumed political face of the rebellion, but he was never, he wasn't walking around carrying an AK-47 during the Civil War. Guillaume Soro was. So, this is something where in 2020, if he's the RDR candidate, even if this election goes really well, even if there's growth, I think the radical elements that still have not really healed from the previous contest and the previous conflict may see this as a major provocation, because it's an ex-rebel who's poised to be leading the country. So this is something I would look closely for potential volatility in the 3 to 5 year time frame. But ultimately, I think that these are minor issues along the bottom line that if I had more money, I would probably invest it in Cote d'Ivoire, and I think it's a very wise place to put your money in. I think that elections are always points of volatility, but this is unlikely to be 2010, 2011. It's unlikely to be as divisive as previous contests, and I could be. There's always the possibility I'm completely wrong. I've highlighted the dynamics that would explain why I would be wrong about that, but I think I would be reasonably confident to say Ouattara victory, low-level violence, and good growth going forward. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to questions that you might have and anything that you'd like a little bit more information on. So thank you very much.